So recording has started. So as we always mention, or standard disclaimer, this call is being recorded and we will place our recording on our YouTube channel. So if you don't want to be recorded, you may want to drop off now. And with that, we're gonna start with our topic of discussion. This is today's discussion is about private link for Azure Resource Manager. So let's quickly get into our uh, talk today. So, I'm really hoping everybody's familiar with Azure Resource Manager and private link. So just like we always do, we do a quick level set on our topics, and then we dive into some of the kind of intricacies and questions, and of course, a short demo. So what is the Azure Resource Manager? The quick 1 minute overview. Azure Resource Manager is the management and deployment service. Basically, that's how you create, update, delete Azure resources. As you know, there used to be an Azure Service Manager, which is used to be known as our classic model. It has been deprecated, and Azure Resource Manager is the way to move forward. So no matter what uh, service you are using, you may be using Portal, you may be using CLI, you may be using PowerShell or SDKs or whatever. Behind the scene, you are calling Azure Resource Manager APIs, REST APIs. Every provider, um, every service, like, for example, storage, database, they have their own providers, and um, you basically register those providers and start. If they are not already registered for your subscription, then you start calling these APIs to manage those resources. So that's the Azure Resource Manager. Okay, and as you can see, any time you're making call, basically you're going through the Resource Manager. And by the way, one important point, it supports full role-based access control, so you can give very granular access what a user can or cannot do, and or a group of user can or cannot do. Okay. The next is private link. We have talked a lot about private link for different services. What is private link? It's Microsoft network level feature. That's how I understand it. The network fiber feature, which allows you to access services like PaaS services like storage, database, app service, or third-party services. As long as they have a standard load balancer, they can be accessed over a private endpoint. So that's the thing. Let's say, and we have seen it, like if you have a storage account, you create a private endpoint to it, drop it into a VNet, and then you can access that service from that private endpoint, from that private IP, and you can block all public access to it. And if that VNet is connected to on-prem, then you can call storage from on-prem, just like you're calling any intranet resource. So that's a very powerful feature. Um, so next, what we're going to take a look at is what mixing these two, having a private link for ARM or Azure Resource Manager, what it brings to the table. What is the motivation behind it? So first of all, there are two things here. One is when you're using ARM services, you're using ARM APIs, you're going over public address space. So if you're using Portal or you were using CLI, with the private endpoint, the ability to access ARM APIs over private endpoint, you're basically now going through a private endpoint. So you access that private endpoint to call the APIs, and from that point on, that private endpoint takes you to the Azure network fiber. So there is no public internet involved. That's one thing. The second thing is very interesting. So second thing is you can basically provide a jump point from only from that jump point you can access Azure services. or Azure management features, not Azure services, Azure management features. So think of it this way. Let's say there's an organization and they have a user who are managing Azure resources, and one of the user ID password is hacked, and somebody sign ins to their account and does some malicious things with the Azure deployment. Okay, does some bad stuff. Okay, so how ARM with private endpoint can help prevent that? The way it will work is you drop a private endpoint, just like in the diagram, into a VNet, and you will set up some ARM management jump boxes there. And those have direct line of sight to that ARM private endpoint. And at that moment, only and you block all other access to Azure ARM from any other place. So now at the moment, the only place you can access ARM or basically do any sorts of resource management like Portal, CLI, PowerShell, or REST API from these jump boxes, which are on the operations VNet. So at that point, you have a kind of um, minimized the chance of data exfiltration or any sort of kind of a malicious access, because now there are two steps. One, you have to have the user ID password, and then you have to be at a certain endpoint or certain location to do any of the management stuff. Even if I have a user ID password, I cannot do management. As you can see from the user VMs, which are in workload VNet, you can't, because there is no private endpoint and they're going over public um, access, and that is blocked. The only access that is okay is connectivity through the ARM private endpoint. Any questions? Okay, so let's quickly, because this is very important concept to realize. And by the way, and we will talk about a few things that, so how you set that up. Okay. The way you set this thing up is you have to have you have to set it up at the management group level. As you know, there's a concept of management group, which can have other management group. This is basically a hierarchical kind of model, which where you can put subscriptions in management groups. You have management groups. Inside management groups, of course, subscriptions. Um, they cannot be in a hierarchy. So, I mean, they're all always at the same level. But what you can do is, let's say that you have a master subscription where you have all your policies that are applicable, that are common. You may move it into a kind of a top level management group, and then you have other subscription in the kind of child management group. So in any case, with Resource Manager, you this private link, you apply it you attach it to the root management group at the moment. Please note it down at the moment. It is only available at the root management group. So there are two key resources that comes into picture here. One is the Resource Manager private link. So you create a Resource Manager private link, and then you associate it to a management group. Right now, this association can only happen with the root level management group. In the future, we may or may not, it may or may not support others, but at the moment, this is happening only at the root management group. Okay, so once that is done, then as you can see in the diagram, you can create private endpoints for management. So you may have multiple VNets where you allow user to do resource management, and only those endpoints you drop only those VNets you drop the private endpoints. Okay, so let's continue. Keep in mind The requirements for creating this are pretty significant. I mean, you have to significant because you have to keep in mind that a person or a user has to have this level owner on the subscription where you are going to be creating resource manager private link resource. So that's resource wherever you are going to be dropping that. This is the private link. Can't think of it as a private link service. You have to have owner or contributor access in that subscription. Second is owner on the subscription, sorry. Owner on or contributor on the resource management group where you're going to be attaching it. But just keep, remember, there are two things. One is the resource manager private link, that's the service. And then you attach it to the management group. In this case, since it's a root management group, you have to have owner or contributor access. And then there are some other things that are there. The global AD administrator must have read access to root management group. Um, so that's where you have to be careful in how you give that access to and how you set that up, because you may find it if you try to run it, and they're not appropriate permissions, then you may get an error. Okay, so that's why you have to once you're setting it up, because remember there are two parts here. One is the private link service, and the second one is the association of that private link service with the management group. Okay. Any questions? So let's go through a quick demo. Okay, so let's go back here and let's open the Azure portal. Oops. Okay, so here is the Azure portal, and we are, so, what I have done is I have created a separate tenant, and in that tenant, I am experimenting with that. So that's why the screen looks different. As you can see, this is a separate Azure AD tenant that I have created. Okay, and in that, there is a tenant management group which has two subscription, Visual Studio Enterprise and Pay As You Go. These are the two subscription. This is the tenant. And let's look at resource management private link. So this is the resource management private link that I've already created. Let's create a new one. Let's look at the experience. Okay. So first of all, as you can see, private link scope at the moment, right now you can only select the tenant root group. That's the thing. Okay. Then this is a subscription. Okay. Subscription in this case is the subscription where your resource manager private link will go. So let's see, I think I have this one. I can drop it in here, region, and then the name. Okay, you can do two. So basically with that, once you do that, then you can create that private link. I'm not going to do that. I already have one. Sorry, a question? Okay. Folks, if there are no questions, please, if you don't mind, can you mute yourself? So let's go in here and let's take a look at this root management private link. There is nothing much to it. There is the resource ID, name, pretty standard stuff. Then there are properties which will have this is this resource ID. And as you can see, this is the resource that is created, which is called resource management private links. Okay, so this is the resource that is being created here. And then if we go in here, these are the private endpoint. I already have created a private endpoint. Okay. If you remember, we talked about two resources. One is the resource management private link, and then the association. Right now, the UI, or at least I could not find a way in the UI, in the portal, to see the association. I have to go through and use the API, the REST API, to get that. So here is the API call, and let's make that call. And as you can see here, format, let me increase the font size to 22. As you can see here, this is the um, this is the URL. So you have management group. I have the name of my management group, and then I'm calling private link association. I want to get a list of all the private link association. So let's take a look. What is that? We can go into our Azure portal and reconnect here. Give it a second. Okay, and let's paste it. Here we go. So as you can see here, it's gonna show you a private link association. This is the ID. This is telling you this is the private link. And if you remember, this is the private link that we have, that I already have created. Public network access is enabled. And then you have um, the scope and all of that information. Okay, just want to mention one thing here. You see public network access enabled, and this is something um, which is at the moment we cannot do. So what if you have played with private link for other services like storage, like app service? In an app service, actually, if you do a private endpoint, you cannot access it publicly. But in storage, you have an option. Once you do a private endpoint, you can keep the public access on, or you can turn it off. Right now, ARM does not have, private link for ARM does not have that option where you can disable public access, because there is a downside to it. If you are not careful and you disable the access, and let's say you cannot log on to the machine which has access to ARM, now you have this kind of big problem. You have disabled access to ARM, you cannot access it from anywhere, and now you cannot log on to that machine or the system, or you cannot access the system from where you were you were accessing it before. Just like we have in the diagram ARM management jump boxes. So that's why. So this so if you're not careful in that scenario, so at the moment it seems like that uh, public network access ability to disable public network access is not there. I hope in the future when they have proper guardrails around it, or proper guidance around it, then they will introduce it. But at the moment, that capability is not there. Okay.
Hey, Navim, this is Len speaking, and if I'm in that situation, if you could just remind us, so what would be the workaround? Deploying the bastion into that VNet, and then just
The workaround would be to open a support ticket, man. Because the problem
okay.
is, here's a scenario. You have disabled all access. Okay, there is basically it is not Azure AD, because right now when let me take you this diagram. When I give this example, I am basically this we are doing it through Azure AD. We are going into Azure AD, and the conditional access, we are saying, hey, disable all access from to Azure VM except from the private endpoints, and these are the private endpoints. Okay, so this is through Azure AD. Right now, there's not an issue. We can go in and we can enable access, and we can go to about our business. But when I'm talking about this this public network access disabled, this is at the ARM level. This has nothing to do with Azure AD. At the ARM level, you're saying no public access allowed, only from private endpoint. And at that moment, if you have disabled, if you have disabled this, so of course you can't go over public IP, and then you somehow you lost access, or like let's say that your machine shut down, and or you lost access to that VM for some reason, somebody deleted it or what. Now you cannot create that VM because in order to create that VM, you need ARM access, and that access endpoint where you can do that is gone. So that's why I think so at the moment that capability is not yet available. Once that becomes available, I'm sure PG will have some guardrails around it, like how safely you can do it. But at the moment, as we speak today, that capability is not there. But this flag here tells me that they will bring about it at some point. I hope that answers your question.
Yep. Thank you, Navin. It does. Thanks.
Any other questions? Okay, so let's go. Oh yeah, so let's. Okay, so
Naveed, sorry. There were a couple of questions in chat. I had one particularly about its current status. It looks like it's still in preview, only available in commercial. Do you know timeline for GA or any kind of roadmap?
No.
For Sovereign Cloud or anything like that as well?
Let's get offline. Let's talk about it offline.
Okay, thanks.
And by the way, if somebody can read questions from the chat window, I can't see the chat window. I would really appreciate.
Yeah, Naveed, I'll read the other one. Somebody had the question is, when would this not be a good idea to enable?
The private? Here's the thing, man. You have to be very careful with this feature because this is kind of a feature with which you can easily, if you're not careful, you can easily shoot yourself in the foot. So that's why, you have to have the requirements. Like, okay, this is a very serious kind of a security requirements there, and we have to have avoid data exfiltration. In that case, in those scenarios, maybe that's where you want to go with this feature and enable once go with that feature. Otherwise, in most of the scenarios, with proper kind of hygiene and security measures, I think that should be enough. But once again, every feature that is out there, you have to weigh pros and cons of using it. So. Oh, yeah. So basically, we have created now a private endpoint. So let's see how we can access it. So I have a virtual machine. This is my Linux virtual machine. I'm running it here. And I want to show you if I do ns lookup on management.azure.com. And by the way, the principle of private endpoint here is the same. You drop a private endpoint, then you drop a management, what we call a private DNS zone. And I can show it to you here as well. Let's go quickly here in that resource group, and you will see here increase the size a little bit. You will see here a private DNS zone. So, private endpoint, and there should be a private DNS zone. Maybe in a different DNS zone. Yes. Yes, this is the one. Private link.azure.com. Sorry, it's in a different. But in any case, this is the management. This is 10.005. So it's pointing to that particular endpoint. And now when I'm calling these, making these ARM calls, for example, very simple call, AZ group list, all of that is going through that private endpoint. And you know what I can do at that moment? I can stop all of the outbound access from that VNet or subnet. Basically, I can say there is no way to access any outbound, all outbound to internet is blocked. And I will still be able to call all my resource management API. So folks, that's pretty much it. I have some resources towards the end. Take a look at it. Any questions?
Hey, Naveed, this is Girish. So this is now in private preview, and the ability to create this is only through one of the methods, or you can do it through like
No, you
PowerShell.
can do it from portal. You can do it from the portal. Right now, it's only portal
Okay.
or REST API. You cannot do it from CLI, or at least I couldn't find a way to do it from CLI.
The other question I have is, like when you create a private endpoint for the ARM service endpoint, is it going to have a scope restriction to a region? What's the scope of the restriction?
Scope, okay. In this case, the scope is your management group, not region. It's a scope. You can drop the private endpoint into a particular VNet, which is of course region specific, but the private endpoint will have access to the top level management group. So any subscription that lives underneath. Yes, private link, a private endpoint will live in a region. Private RMPLS, which is a resource management private link service, will live in a region. But that particular, I mean, what we call the scope is the top level management group.
You mean the effect of
Yes,
creating
the
this
effect.
will impact at the top?
Top. Yep.
So is it like the root management group, or or is it some
root?
Sorry,
Root
I
management.
missed that.
Yeah. Root management.
Oh, it's at the root. Okay.
Yep.
So you kind of block the entire, the things under that.
That's right. Yes. So it will at the moment. Maybe in the future they allow us to go to different scopes, but right now it is the top level management group.
Okay. That's a pretty serious restriction. Okay. Thank you.
Anything else? Any other questions?
I'm wondering when someone would really need this, because this is like overly restrictive.
Yeah,
and
I mean
then
that's why I think what we talked about, the data exfiltration concerns, has to be there when you will absolutely need it. It's not for every organization. The organization, maybe it's a very kind of organization with very tight regulations and all that. In that scenario, this will come into picture.
Once you create that, you need to create tunnels to for legitimate users to access.
You have to have jump boxes, some sort, to get people on to it and do it. And yeah, you have to be careful about it. So yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. That's all I had.
Okay, any other questions? Thank you very much for joining, everyone, and I will post the recording on our YouTube channel, and have a wonderful weekend. Stay safe, folks.